This is Nikiforos Diamandouros. I understand I've been introduced by Mrs. Sokou in the previous panel. I've been asked to address the topic of metakenosis to dialogue, modern Greece's relationship with the West in macrohistorical perspective. Let me first thank Mrs. Sokou for inviting me to this particular event, and Mr. Tsomokos for including me in the activities of the sixth forum, Delphi Forum. I'm particularly pleased to do that, particularly since I spent a long part of my life, over 20 years, in the United States, and feel very much a part of the United States society and of the Greek link with the United States. Now, the topic of metakenosis to dialogue presents a number of challenges. Metakenosis is a rather difficult word. It was coined by the great 18th century, 19th century intellectual father of the Greek War of Independence, Diamandouros, and its meaning was that he was envisaging a flow of information on culture and education flowing from the West towards Greece, with an eye to helping Greece somehow recapture its links with the Western world, Western civilization, and obviously a throwback to classical times. So metakenosis is loaded, if you please, with implications of a conscious approach from Greece towards the United States and vice versa, approach that certainly underpins a sense of late development, a sense of retardation, a sense of intellectual and also social, political, and other underdevelopment. So it is that is the context that is conveyed by the concept of metakenosis and the idea of hoping to be able to generate a flow from the advanced world towards Greece in the early 20th century. Korais wrote his famous memorandum on the actual state of civilization in Greece in 1803. And it was in that context that he, in fact, formulated this idea of metakenosis. And the central point of my own remarks to you today will be to try and trace the trajectory from this original position of, if you please, underdevelopment and retardation to the current situation, which I use the word dialogue to, in fact, as to anchor it around, of a much more equal and much more fruitful exchange. This means, however, that I will have to operate at two separate levels, parallel levels, and to construct my argument along these lines. The first level is the level of the intellectual climate that relates to Greece's relations with the United States and the West. And that, by definition, refers to intellectual, culture, scholarly works. But at a different level, and I was struck by that when I was watching the last panel on foreign relations between Greece and the United States, at a different level, at a societal level primarily, the contact between Greece and the United States, the contact between Greece and Western Europe was very deep, very dynamic, and is very much worth exploring in parallel with the, if you please, elite phenomenon of intellectual development and intellectual climate. Let me become a bit more specific. The concept of metakenosis refers inevitably as I said again, to an intellectual development and an intellectual climate of a transfer of knowledge, a transfer of information, a transfer of know-how, the transfer, if you please, of skills and intellectual and cultural capital from the more developed world of the late 18th and early 19th century to Greece. And it also is a very implicit, if not explicit, acknowledgement that these skills and this capital was in great dearth in Greece at the time of the War of Independence. Now, at the same time, I'm going now to the societal level. At the same time, at the time of the War of Independence, and particularly in the latter part of it, American involvement and engagement with the efforts of the War of Independence became very obvious and very prominent. It is particularly in 1827 and 1828 when, for a number of reasons, the war effort is beginning to peter out, and there's a great deal of destitution, a great deal of suffering, a great deal of destruction in Greece in the war fronts. It's at that point that Americans and American society become much more directly involved in the Greek situation. The great names we know about are obviously Samuel Gridley Howe and Jonathan Peckham Miller and George Jarvis, but there are very many more. And under the guidance of this particular effort and these people, there were significant exchanges of goods. There were ships that came from the United States to Greece, particularly with critically needed resources, food, clothing, and all that. And that, in fact, expressed, if you please, a very important mobilization of American society at the time, which was very moved, particularly following the fall of Missolonghi and the death of Lord Byron in that siege. A great deal of mobilization, which led to the naming of very many American cities by Greek names. Okay, in Michigan we have Ypsilanti. I use that as an example of the kind of impact that was then going on in the United States, and of the fact that in very many cities, particularly in Boston and New York and others, there were committees which were formed to be able to support charitable initiatives to be able to save the Greeks. So the point so far is that when we're talking about metakenosis, we're talking about a movement from the West to Greece at the level of ideas, but also underpinning that there is a very significant intercourse between Greece and the United States at the social level, the societal level, that takes the particular form of charity, of compassion, of great identification with the sufferings of the Greek people at the time. Now, that dual structure, if you please, that dual level of relations, maintained itself pretty much for about a century. In other words, American engagement, both intellectual and societal, remained at a similar level. The intensity, obviously, of the American involvement of the late 1820s was not in any way replicated, but it remained distinct, which is another way of saying that Philhellenism maintained its presence in the United States, and that therefore there was a continual kind of flow at the intellectual level. At the societal level, it is important to know that beginning in the late 19th century, the flow was reversed. In other words, Greece partakes of the large exodus of the great migration from Europe to the United States, which was very much a part of what took place in Italy, took place in Germany, took place in part of Eastern Europe, and certainly in Greece, where very significant numbers of Greeks emigrated to the United States and settled there and made the United States their second country. So there again, you have this interaction, and that interaction at the societal level clearly bred at the intellectual level, at the elite level, also a degree of exchange of ideas, which would underpin this whole notion of metakenosis, which, however, during this period remains the constant theme is metakenosis means in this early part of what I'm describing, 19th century, early 20th century, remains a standard idea of transferring from the West to East, and Greece being the recipient of intellectual, political, and cultural capital from the United States, but also from Europe. Now, this situation of the charity-driven link between the US and Greece, I'll give you another example, is poignantly seen in the presence of Ambassador Henry Morgenthau, who was the American ambassador to the Ottoman Empire during the First World War, and then after the First World War, became involved with the League of Nations and deeply involved in the Commission for the Exchange of Populations following Greece's defeat in the Greek-Turkish War of 1919-1922 that ended with the catastrophic defeat of the Greek forces and the withdrawal, the forced exchange of populations that brought about 1.5 million Orthodox Christian subjects of the Ottoman Empire, mostly Greek-speaking, overwhelmingly Greek-speaking, to Greece, and about 800,000 Muslim inhabitants of Greece to the new state of Turkey under Kemal Atatürk. So at that time, Henry Morgenthau played a very important role within the context of the Commission for the Exchange and the League of Nations. Another demonstrable example, if you please, of this contact, the interaction between US society and Greek society, another sense of the way in which metakenosis plays itself out in unanticipated ways. Then I believe that a significant change, evolution, takes place following the end of the Second World War. At a time, in other words, when the United States emerges as the undisputed world power and world leader, and given the confrontation of the Soviet Union and the Cold War, Greece becomes a front line in that confrontation, hence the Marshall Plan, hence the Truman Doctrine, hence the overwhelming presence of the United States in Greece. I think this is a point in which I can now intersect what Mrs. Soku said in her remarks in the previous panel introducing my own lecture. At the height of the American presence in Greece, we had a regrettable collapse of democratic institutions and the imposition of military rule. That imposition of military rule sent a large number of Greeks abroad. Many of them settled in Paris, and Paris became, if you please, a center for intellectual reaction and fermentation in favor of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. But also commensurably, and I'm going back to the United States, this is a moment where in the United States we perceive a significant shift, if you please, in the intellectual content of scholarly production that takes place, at least in major US universities. I will single out a few examples of that, simply to underscore my point about the extent to which the late 60s and the early 70s, which I note parenthetically, are moments of great tumult and great ferment in the United States. Remember the 1960s, late 1960s, student uprisings in major campuses, both in the West Coast and the East Coast, and at Columbia, where I was at the time, at Berkeley, and very many other universities. Great ferment, great protests in favor of democracy, in favor of, if you please, human rights. At that time, then, the intellectual production in the United States, in major universities, also resonated with a new kind of approach to how Greece was perceived. I will just use 4 or 5 examples of that one as an intellectual ancestor. I repeat, ancestor of these developments. I will refer to the brilliant work written in 1940 at Columbia University by a constitutional lawyer called Nicholas Kalchas, which was entitled Introduction to the Constitutional History of Modern Greece, a brilliant short monograph which opened up new vistas on how, in fact, Greece was to be seen, by first suggesting that the developments that took place in the 1820s and the developments that took place during the War of Independence were harbingers of things to come. In other words, that Greece was no longer only profiting from metakenosis, but that at the same time, there were, in fact, new interpretations coming forward, of which Kalchas was one stellar example, to try and recast that perception in more, if you please, modern terms that were in line with the intellectual traditions prevailing at the time in the major universities of the East Coast. And then in the 60s, the late 1960s, you have at Columbia University a very interesting master's thesis by John Alexander, who focused on the destruction of the Kleptic institution in the Peloponnesus in 1806, and then again looked, if you please, at these social developments in a way that departed from the traditional event-oriented interpretations and understandings of Greek history that had been pretty prevalent until then, by introducing more social and political dimensions into the readings of Greek history at the time, and focusing particularly on how the Ottoman Empire essentially destroyed the military element which existed in the Peloponnese alone, the Kleptic institution there, and what its consequences were for the balance of power in the Peloponnese between, if you please, the military element and the civilian element. The result of which was, of course, that the embeddedness of political power and civilian control in the Peloponnese, as opposed to central Greece, Roumeli, where in fact the power of the armatols and the armatoliks, the armed guards in the employ of the Ottoman Empire, who held sway over the territory, was undisputed. Another example of scholarly contributions that comes out of that time is the brilliant and regrettably still unpublished doctoral dissertation on the Philikieteria written in 1971 by George D. Frangos at Columbia University. Frangos, who did his research in both Greece, but particularly in Romania, where he researched the archives of the Philikieteria, was the first one to open a new venue, a new avenue, a new exploration of the Philikieteria, again, as a social and political coalition, and moving away from hagiographic accounts of the Philikieteria that had been prevalent until then. Also, in 1971, at Harvard University, Dennis Skiotis completed a extremely important dissertation on Ali Pasha, the Pasha of Yanina, who held sway over large swathes of Greece, of central Greece. And according to Skiotis, the argument that he put forward was that the capacity of Ali Pasha to be able to foment insurrection, to foment revolution in his territories, forced the Ottoman military and political powers to focus its attention towards him, thereby giving the possibility to the south of his territories, to the Greeks in the Peloponnese in particular, and in the Rumeli, to prepare for their uprising. A very important and a very interesting kind of analysis, which again broke new ground. And I'm referring again, in the context of metakenosis, we are looking now at a new trend, a new intellectual trend that ushers into a greater degree of maturity, if you please, of the scholarship at the time. And the last example that I will mention on this one is my own work on the institution, the attempt to create a modern state during the War of Independence by introducing lock, stock, and barrel instruments of modern, liberal modern states, inspired by the ideals of the American Revolution, but also the French Revolution, inspired by principles of liberalism, constitutionalism, the rule of law, the idea of creating a modern state and a regular army, and of recasting church-state relations in such a way that the state would be able to be separate from the church. These were very new ideas which went against, if you please, the traditional historiographic interpretations of the War of Independence, the hagiographic elements of it, and also the idea of what the late Constantine Vimaras, the great scholar of Greek philology, said at one point, or termed as teleological ethnocentrism, meaning the tendency to interpret Greek history in a sense, assuming that from the very beginning of history, all forces moved gradually towards the ultimate goal of creating an independent Greek state. Romantic, inventive, but historically inaccurate. So there are some very, I think, salient examples which suggest to us how by the late 1960s and 70s, in the context of the ferment and the tensions, the social and political tensions that had seized both Western Europe and the United States, relations and perceptions of Greece changed. A new type of literature came forward, which was more critical, which was more socially conscious, which was more politically conscious, and which also tried to put forward instruments, research instruments, methodological instruments, which were very much in line with the latest developments in the social sciences in both the United States, but also in Europe. The next big moment, if you please, or milepost is 1974. In 1974, what we have is the fall of the military regime and the emergence of what to date remains the most stable, the most secure, the more liberal, the most entrenched democratic regime Greece has ever known. This is a regime which draws its inspiration from the legacy of the War of Independence, draws its inspiration from the legacies that came through metakenosis, draws its inspiration from the traditions of the rule of law that are very much a part of the American and also the European tradition. And it has become a standard feature of the Greek political system, which was able to withstand the great strains that it underwent during the great crisis following the Lehman Brothers collapse and the world crisis beginning in 2008 until 2019. So there again, you have an important development, and that development is important in the sense that 1974 marks rupture. We no longer have Greece being the object of metakenosis, no longer have Greece as being perceived as a country that in need, an underdeveloped, late developing country in need of transfer of knowledge only in one way, but we have a two-way conversation, a two-way trend. And also, as Greece enters the European Union, and I will conclude with this comment, as Greece becomes part of the European Union, Greece develops a different, equally beneficial, more equal relationship with the United States and is being perceived as such by the United States. There were enlightened American diplomats at the time, Monty Stearns and Edmund Keeley come to mind from these periods, who in fact understood the shift and nurtured it forward, thereby in fact embedding a new relationship between Greece and the United States that in fact endures to this day. I think that that type of climate only stands to benefit from the new administration of Joe Biden, and very much hope that it will continue in the trend that it has, thereby completing or solidifying the long trip, tortuous, turbulent, difficult, long trip from metakenosis, late development and underdevelopment, to dialogue among partners in the European Union, partner in NATO, which is of course a very major link of Greece with the United States, partners at both the societal level and the intellectual level. Thank you very much.